Hey everyone, this next recording is for Economics Unit 14, which covers lessons 66 through 70. The topics that we're going to go over are what the farming industry has looked like and has changed, how it's changed over time, and how the government has had to step in some instances, the foundation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the reason why that was created. We'll talk a little bit about productivity and the government's role in ensuring that we are a productive country. And the last topic would be going over the decades from 1920 to 2008 and the times in those decades in which the government has had to do some economic interventions. So, starting off with farming, the 1860s saw the Americans had about there were about 2 million farms during that era, and over time, less than 100 years later, there's 6 million farms. So it tripled, and the result of that was that we have an overabundance and good growth and all those things. However, after the next 60 years or so, it didn't fare so well for farms. There's lots of reasons for that, but trade negotiations and the way in which that I guess other countries and what their resources are and how they price it and the tariffs and all that, our farms have decreased, at least as of 2014, to 2 million farms. So we're back to what we were 200 years ago, which is something I find interesting. But because of trade, something like that could occur. So because we have seen, 4 million farms go out of business or stop happening, it tells economists something. And it's not all bad, because what could be part of that picture is, for instance, the farms that are in the United States are larger. So although they're not multiples, that would make up a large number like 6 million. They're smaller, or they're bigger farms, which end up being a smaller number of them. So it isn't totally indicative of a good, of how well the farming industry is doing just by saying the number of farms there are because of that. So keep that in mind. Whenever you see data, you question it. Really think on, is that really bad or not, and in which ways? And here's some other more thoughts to think about when it comes to that number. And the fact that there are some advancements. So you can do a lot more with little. So because of a lot of advancements in technology in farming, it has enabled one farm to produce that much more, that much faster, that much cheaper and better than before. So although it's a harder industry to get into, because you have to have all that equipment and you have to have the land and things, and it's a high startup cost. But once you're in the industry, or it's a family business or something, you don't have those startup costs, and you can pick up where your forefathers left off. Which means, all of these resources are at your fingertips, and you have an easy in. Which means that not as many farms are needed, because you can do a lot more with little. So hence the bigger farms and things. So something to consider when you see those numbers. Not all bad, but you can see all the advancements there, and you'll need to know what those include. But a lot of that, some of that stuff is pretty interesting, like satellites, the development of that. You can see which areas of your properties are doing well or not as well, just by using satellite imaging, and to figure out and land mapping, and computers that can tell you the humidity in your air and things like that, and soil tests, and using pesticides and things. It's quite amazing how far the farming industry has come in the last 200 years. It's amazing. So a little bit more on farms here. The largest crop in the United States is corn, and it's because it's used for ethanol, and there was a mandate the government put into place called the Renewable Fuel Mandate, and it required oil refiners to include that ethanol, which means that it's going to be in demand, which is why it would be the largest crop in corn. Now, something to think about is, why would the United States want a renewable fuel mandate? Oftentimes I learn the most by asking why. Why would they do that? And the whole point of requiring that is so that we, again, rely less on OPEC, rely less on oil and gas, and use less of those fuels. And instead, if we can use a natural, reusable, I guess, energy source like corn to produce ethanol that decreases the need or amount used of gas, then it can be a way of creating a more stable economy for the United States, because we don't have to rely as much upon those like OPEC. And I know in the last decade or two there's been a big push for having our own oil sources and own refineries ourselves, so we can control the cost of refining it. We can control the source of our oil, and Alaska, and I think there was a place in the continental, another place in the continental United States that we've been able, I think maybe Texas, or I don't know. There's been a couple different places in which we were able to have a reserve, so that if OPEC decides to, go on strike and, put prices insanely high, that we are able to make it through that strike phase without it monumentally impacting our economy and pushing us into recession of some sort. So it's a little bit about fuel and how farms impact your gas price and or your ability, the United States quantity of gas. So you never know what I think the reason why I like economics in this way is that you don't know where the next impact is going to come from. How in the world would we have known 100 years ago that farms were going to have an impact on gas? It's so neat to me that how it changes over time. So a note on farming. The first time that the government really stepped in to assist farms was in the Great Depression. The New Deal was struck, and the government helped with price supports and crop restrictions, so that there wasn't too much of one product to price, in which it would make the demand go down, which makes the price go down, and which if they could restrict how much of crop was planted that year, it would help with pricing and help with farming. So it allowed farmers to be smarter, governments to not have to step in as much by putting on those restrictions at that time. So some government has to do some strange stuff to make things work out better in the end, and that was just one of them. So initially there were colleges that were created using state-owned properties, and they sold that land to universities so that they could have a college that would enable them to improve the methods that they use to farm, and they had the ability to conduct the research that they needed to improve the knowledge that they needed to increase productivity in farming. So government stepped in those little ways like that, to create the kind of infrastructure that really the farming industry needed to be as successful as it is today. So moving on to the Environmental Protection Agency, which is what EPA stands for. It was put into place in 1970. And it was that era, that decade, because just before that, there were several different things that had happened that made the government realize we got to, business have their own interests, and we have to be careful on how much they take advantage of the public. And environmentalists fight business interests, and they fight for the earth, for our resources, for fighting against contaminations. And the businesses will trash, and they're in it for a profit, and they don't care what happens. And so EPA was set up to prevent that and avoid that. One big example that the book gives is in 1962, there was a book that was written by Rachel Carson, and she talks about the widespread use of DDT and what happened because of that. So DDT, you might want to look it up, but it's a chemical that was widely used on crops. I think it was a weed deterrent or something like that. And what happened was the ground in which that was sprayed with had water runoff that made it into the streams, and the streams that had that DDT in it contaminated the fish that were in those streams. And as you'll guess, the bird that ate the fish in those rivers that were contaminated were bald eagles. And they didn't kill the bald eagles. However, when the bald eagles hatched eggs, the eggs were too fragile. They didn't hold together, and the chicks wouldn't make it. The eggs wouldn't last. They were not hard shells; they were soft, and they tied that back to DDT, as the lady who wrote the book called Silent Spring wrote about all the impacts of what happened when DDT was used. And so it was put out. The EPA ensured that DDT was no longer able to be produced for that purpose. So just cutting off the supply to the public and using that as a means. So I think I Wikipedia'd that last year and ended up finding a lot of it, and that's how I know all of that information, because I really wanted to get a good grasp on how did that whole movement start. I think that EPA stuff is of interest to me because, as Christians, God tells us to take care of what we have, and it's always been a big bother to me when people don't really know what we have and what a gem that it is and a gift that God gave us with this green earth, and they don't take care of it, because a lot of times it's one and done. You ruin it and it's ruined for life, or it takes decades or centuries to get land back to the way it should have been. And it really bothers me when people take advantage of the public. So anyway, other ways in which that business interests have superseded the public, in which was the Pebble Mine, in which it was a mining operation that was going to contaminate and or reduce the property of what would contain a salmon habitat, and some legislation and issues arose when it was going to damage that area. And not only that, but it was in the interest of the salmon industry to ensure that didn't happen either, because thousands of jobs could be lost if that habitat wasn't properly taken care of because of that mine. So there's a balancing act. People want to mine, but people want to have a salmon industry, and so you have to work between both to ensure that both can successfully cohabitat, co-live. Both can happen. So it's the EPA has its role in maintaining a good balance for both. So another a good example, and we've used this before in class, is in 2014 when Flint, Michigan had a water contamination, and the lasting impacts that had on the people that were contaminated. They didn't have the requirements, weren't put into place to ensure that the water wouldn't be contaminated, and there were some ripple effects because of that, but the EPA is put into place so that, that people would have, the public could be protected, and that standards could be put into place, and that there is an agency to protect the public. They step in and into those situations and roles. So the last note here on EPA is one of their biggest ways that they control and protect, and it is the caps and trades that has been allowed to be put into place. So each business that has any large amount of emissions, so we're talking about carbon emissions, so think big manufacturing, industrial, high grade stuff, businesses, and there is a cap that the EPA puts on them, in which they can only emit so many carbon molecules in a day or a month or a week, or a certain time frame. And what happens is they have to track it, and once they reach a cap, that's it. So it's regulated by the EPA, and to ensure, and it's enforced by them to ensure that they don't go over that certain amount, so that they aren't damaging, the public, they aren't damaging the environment, they aren't hurting other businesses. That there's a reason why there's smog in London and not, in every city in the United States, and that's just why. And what they also have allowed them, though, them as in businesses, to trade that cap. So if one business is finding out that they're not even going to meet their cap, they can trade that cap for another industry's cap, another business's cap. And so by trading that, it allows them to, one, business to increase production up to a certain point, and the other one, is fine where they're at, and they can just, they don't need as much, so they can make a profit in a trade based on what their needs are. And that is, some bureaucracy stuff that happens in the EPA, but and legal battles can ensue because of that. But the negative impact of that is that, the money that could be used, it's the EPA, having lawsuits against certain companies is money that really could be used at best elsewhere. However, it is protecting the public, and so it has to be a good trade-off. Whatever litigations are happening, need to ensure that the public's best interest is at mind, the money is going in the right spot. So not just because they wanted it to be a high-profile case, but that it's really going to be the most beneficial in the end. So EPA, they can abuse their power if they want to. I don't know that they always have the public's. I guess they might have they might care more about the environment than they do about the people itself. At some point, there's a trade that it becomes less of one and more of the other. So that's something that they don't always do successfully at. But the whole point of it is so that the public as a whole and our economy isn't hindered because of one industry or company or another. So moving on to the topic of productivity. The government focuses a little bit on productivity because it greatly impacts what our GDP is, our gross domestic product. So the whole idea behind outputs and inputs is that you aren't inputting more than you're outputting, and that your productivity isn't too low, because what happens is the more time and people and resources are used that aren't producing, and or if the low productivity, it means that there's going to be insufficient materials, and electricity is unreliable, and machines can't be maintained. It really means that the government is making sacrifices. On some point, they aren't making as much money as far as taxes go, and it only is going to mean the worse for them in the end. If you always think of the government as a business, they don't want insufficient low productivity. They want to pump out as much products for as much money for as many places as possible. So their goal is to ensure that businesses are have sufficient materials and electricity and machinery so that they can make the most profit, so that the government can make the most profit. So that they focus on that productivity. Look at productivity numbers for the United States. This slide kind of helps you get an idea of how they encourage and discourage certain things. So if the government can encourage investments into our own United States, then they can, what they try to do with that is basically they have tools to encourage people to keep their money in the United States instead of taking it elsewhere. If they can keep taxes low and inflation rates low, and they can maintain a stable financial market, then they're a lot more likely to invest in the United States. So that's one tool the government uses to make themselves more profitable. Another way is to lessen poverty. So any ways in which the government can improve opportunities for employment to like one example would be when Toyota wants to build a plant in the United States, that they find a way to make it happen. That's new opportunities for United States workers to be employed, and lessens the opportunities for poverty to be prevalent. So in any which ways that the entrepreneurs can make a profit. Okay, so that ends productivity and ways the government has stepped in and created solutions, and the EPA has assisted in the public. And now we're moving on to the last topic, which is the decades in which the government has had to have some sort of economic intervention for some reasons. So what each decade has had in the United States had its own economic impact, or certain things were done and that had some ripple effects. So we're going to start in the 1920s and go to the 1990s. So starting out with 1920, buying stocks, you could buy stocks on margin, which means you did not have to have the money to buy the stock. You could take a loan out to buy the stock, which means you can buy more with less. So that has an impact in the stock market. 1920s saw a tax rate decrease on income tax because there was a surplus. The government was in a place where they were in the black, is what you call it. They were making a profit. They were not in debt, and so what they tried to do is try to give that back to the American public in the form of lowering their taxes. 1929, the stock market lost 13% of its value, and that initiated the what later became the Great Depression, and Black Friday occurred, which is not what it means now. The stock market crashed, and that's how I think in one day it lost 13% of its value. So the next year, in 1930s, the banking industry was doing very poorly because of all of that, and there were bank runs, and the fractional reserve banking made it, and there were no limits to the numbers, and so which made it even the banking industry made it so that it was the money supply was low. They loaned out too much of their reserve, which made the Great Depression last a lot longer in the United States than it needed to have. But in 1941, the U.S. entered the World War II, and that greatly increased our GDP, and it changed into different ways. And war is a money-making kind of industry because the government needed to purchase a lot to make to be able to be in war, and industries thrived on the amount of resources that a government needed to be able to enter into a war like that. So in 1944, because of the cost of the war, taxes were raised, and it hurt those anybody who had invested the money that they did in the businesses who that put into the war. So it you win some, you lose some. So that's just a little bit on some of the decades. And the last one I wanted to mention was in the late 1990s. That's when there was a high-tech bubble. They called it a bubble because the tech industry was taking off and it hit a peak, and that's what it was referring to. So I'm going to make mention of that. Moving into the 21st century, 2008 was a big year for the United States in that we hit a recession because prime mortgages were encouraged, and which were loans that were given out to people who were not very good candidates for a mortgage, who didn't have a very good record. And the defaults on loans that happened made it so that the banks didn't have the money for the other loans in which they were called upon to pay. So when the money's not coming in, money can't go out, and the debt that the banks went into meant that the government had to step in and just all those issues that came up and take over banks that failed. And there were a decent amount of what they call mortgage-backed securities, in which mortgage companies and or banks would take a grouping of mortgages, and they would sell those off to companies as an investment. And what happened is, if there was a discrepancy between those measures, they would in what they sold and what they bought it for, they could lose money there, meaning they wouldn't have the supply that they needed for it. So it was a hot mess. But if you have any interest in the mortgage industry or why that recession happened, I highly recommend you look it up and kind of get a little more info on what were the warning signs that might happen, and what was the big fallout from that, because it maybe not at your time, but I guess maybe during my time it was a bigger deal. A lot of anything that impacted anything that impacted, I guess, the home manufacturing and mortgage industry was greatly impacted, like new construction and anything that goes into a home, there's quite a few products. So that whole industry, crashed quite a bit for a long period of time because of that. So if you can't get a mortgage, then there's no need for the home, which means there's no need for all the products that go into the home. So it's a domino effect there that you'll see, which is why I think it's kind of it's important and interesting to look back a little in the past of an economy and see what happened, and look at how you could prevent it. What were the ways in which the government could have stepped in. So one thing that is a side note in that, but through any economic hard time, you'll find different people, our governments, have created different solutions, or companies have, and one of them is commercial paper. And commercial paper just means that it's a short-term loan just to be able to make that payroll happen. If you have payroll like every 2 weeks, that's most average what most companies do. If you don't have the money in your savings to be able to pay for that payroll when it comes up, you can take a short-term loan to be able to pay your workers still and not lose them as employees until you have the short-term resources to get that money back to pay back that loan. It's called commercial paper. So, to get out of that hole in 2008, the government passed the Economic Stimulus Act in 2008, so that it would stimulate us out of the recession a lot quicker than we could have otherwise. And the government took controlling interest in General Motors. They were part of the issue during that recession. And Bear Stearns, which was a mortgage company that failed, government paid for $30 billion in liabilities that the company had, and as a result, the banking industry saw a lot more regulation, and especially in the mortgage industry. But nowadays there are high and I guess a lot more and a lot stricter requirements on what is in reserve and how risky the loans can be, and they run through scenarios that banks have to pass, especially if they're the large ones. So if you're not talking about little dinky bank, that's not really what we're referring to, but the biggest banks in the United States are the ones in which that can impact the United States the most. And so the government ensures that they can pass a lot of stress tests, is what they call them, to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and that it's not something that as you can see during the Great Depression, it was the banks made it worse because of how they managed the money, and they can make it better by how they manage money. And so the government steps in to make sure that they don't make our economy any worse than it needs to be when something bad happens. So that wraps up all of Unit 14. I hope you learned a lot, and we'll see you next time.